the director of Chevron Center of Research Excellence at Texas A&M, where students from engineering, geology, geochemistry, and geophysics, as myself, were advancing techniques for basin modeling. John also focuses on combining engineering data with water chemistry observations and measurements to help improve well economics. So, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. John Pantano. Dr. John, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I hope that we can share with you some of our learnings that we've had by looking at water chemistry and trying to figure out preferential flow paths. Steve Franks at Rock Fluid Systems and I have been working on this for a little while, and it's kind of neat that we've kind of combined both the diagenesis, thermal histories, and looking at different ways that we can see preferential fluid paths. But before I get going, I want to also give special thanks for the collaboration with Sean at Hess, who helped do a couple of really instrumental studies that we had some hypotheses and we did some data collection and some interpretation. And there's a ERTEC paper and an AAPBG presentation that I'll be pointing to. Also want to thank Claudia at Marathon, who helped refine and integrate a couple of other disciplines along this work. And Abdullah, who is currently helping us analyze this type of information to improve recovery and possible planning on resources. And then finally, I'd like to thank Zhang with ZetaWare for allowing us to do our data interpretation and map making inside of Trinity and modeling different kinetics in Genesis. Well, the big thing that we're often asked, and I think what was really appropriate was a previous speaker for this series talked about discrete fracture networks. And we kind of can see fracture networks in the surface, and we do a lot of modeling of what the fracture networks look like in the subsurface. But one of the big questions is, well, just because there's a fracture there, and even if we put proppant in it or we don't put proppant in it, what are these preferential fluid paths? What connects these different units that hold different types of fluids in different types of rock? And so when we start to produce wells and we start to inject things into the other wells, where do those fluids go? Where do they come back into production? So these are some of the questions that we're always trying to ask ourselves. And so we really tried to figure out, well, how can we actually ground truth this? We can't dig up the earth and actually see where the fluid's flowing, but is there some way for us to trace back where did that fluid come from? So we started off with some assumptions, and none of this is radically earth-shaking. It's like, well, depositional environment establishes both the mineralogy and the water, pore water chemistry. So the connate water. What is the water that is born with the sediments? Was it deposited in the sea? Was it in a restricted basin? Was it, in a salt flats? Where was that depositional unit deposited? Then we understand that as things get buried, both the mineralogy and the chemical composition and grain size will decide how much diagenesis occurs. We know that surface area, that something that's very, very small is going to be much more reactive than something that has very little surface area, just like a boulder. So we're going to know that the tighter the system, in terms of the finer the grain, we might have more chemical reactions. Some of those chemical reactions are not always obvious. Some of them are, well, guess what? When we change from one mineral to another mineral, we release fresh water. And while in other ones, we're putting things into that formation water. So the diagenesis is kind of linked together. I have a couple of slides over on the right-hand side that basically say, oh, the porosities are the same, but really the permeabilities are orders of magnitude difference. And so on some logs, we would say, oh, it's got a porosity of this, but when we start to look at it, the permeability, the interfacial tension, or the entry pressure is going to be quite different. So we believe that if we look at this as a whole system, when we start to look at produced water chemistry, we might be able to identify which facies did the produced water actually come from. So we've got a workflow that basically is 4 steps. And with those 4 steps, we think we can actively improve hydrocarbon recovery. But before we can start to do that, we need to know what is being produced. So whether we're doing a water flood or we're doing a fracture stimulation of these wells, we are taking water from the surface and we're injecting it into the subsurface at very high pressures. So first thing we have to know, if we want to know which formation it's coming from, is how much did we dilute that water? And then also, if we look at how much frac water we produce back, or how much water flood water we produce back, we can then get an idea of possibly which paths that injected water goes, because we might lose a bunch of that water, or we might be able to recover all that water. And as that water is coming back, it will pick up at the signature of the facies that it actually flowed through. So I'll first talk about how do we differentiate what is operational water or frac water. And then once we figure out that, I'll show you how we do that in stable isotopes. I'll talk about how do we allocate which facies the formation comes from. So the produced water will have formation water and operational water. So the first part of the talk is differentiating between man-provided water and then geological water. And then when we look at the geological waters, we can say which geological formation did it come from. So let's look at using stable isotopes as a way to identify operational water versus subsurface water. So this is a map of the world that has oxygen isotopes. And basically, according to the way we've come up with the standard, is basically 0 is going to be what is the oxygen isotope ratio of seawater. So 0 is seawater. And then as seawater evaporates and we go into the hydrosphere, what happens is things become more negative as we go to the north, okay? And as we change elevation. So things that are near the coastline are going to have water at the surface. And so all of the oxygen that's in the H2O, we can actually analyze it, and then we get a ratio of 18. So it's this figure, right? This symbol right here. So number one, I just want to give the definition of operation water. It can be drilling. We got a lot of possible lost circulation, completions, fracturing, water flood. And we even have seen where you can get rid of scale, we do different sort of maintenance. And we've picked up that there was maintenance on a well that as researchers, we didn't know they had scheduled maintenance, but in the chemistry, we were able actually to pick up maintenance event. So let's look at some possible data. So over here on the left, what we have is a traditional stable isotope of oxygen versus hydrogen. And in another graph, you'll see where this local meteoric line is basically sort of related to that graph or that map that I showed you previously. The thing that I wanted to point out that Mark Engel and his researchers at the USGS sampled a bunch of produced waters, and the Edwards, for your information, is a lot deeper than the Eagleford. And so it's got a different mineralogy, but you can see that they kind of group over here where they're a bigger positive number in terms of oxygen, and they become lighter or more negative in hydrogen relative to sea level. So this is the sea level point. And you can see how the different formations group in different areas. And when you start to collect produced waters in a certain zone, you actually can see that this is the up dip section, and then this is the down dip section. Now, that is to illustrate the geological variations of stable isotopes. ConocoPhillips, Jason and his co-workers showed a way that they say, okay, the makeup of the frac water had oxygen and hydrogen isotope ratio of this right here. And this is down in Texas. And remember, the closer you are to the ocean or the seawater, the closer that water that's being precipitated is going to look like that. And you can see that when you take a measurement right here, these waters are probably 50% produced water and 50% formation water. Where something over here, which is always kind of a art, is where do you believe the true Eagle Ford formation water points right there? And so it's just basically a mixing line that you can say it's between this and that. You know, in Jason's paper, this is a fairly wide cluster. We sometimes see when we focus it on a specific area, we don't see this much scatter. But the thing is, even with the scatter, you can tell which is more than 50% or what is less than 50% formation water and which is stimulation water. The best area that we can actually show both the isotope of water, oxygen and hydrogen, and the formation signature, which is the strontium, are studies that have been done up in the Williston Basin. And this is from a paper that was done with Hess. The co-authors are up here and it's available online. But basically in map view, we had a Three Forks well, which is red, and a Middle Bakken well, which is green. And so when we look at it in wine rack view, you can see that there's 350 feet between the Middle Bakken well, and then on the logs, you'll be able to see where the Three Forks well is. So the Three Forks is deeper, and you can sort of see what that spacing is. So we're going to look at some of the stable isotopes first, and then we'll look at the strontium. So remember, the further north you go, you come, so here is in the hydrogen versus oxygen, seawater is right in this big blue thing. Because of the colder climate and the elevations, we're much more negative than Saudi Arabia and the actual seawater. And you can then see that this was the samples that were taken of all the waters that were used by that operator. And then these were all the samples of the produced waters. So to give you an idea of what was going on when these samples were collected, we had continuous monitoring of both the flow rate. So here is the gas flow rate in red. I'll talk about this little hump right here. And then here's the flow rate of water for the Middle Bakken. And then here's the flow rate for the gas in green. And this was a continuous measurement of specific gravity through time, corrected for 60 degrees. And then you can see when we took grab samples along that period of time. So this is the Middle Bakken. And now what's really interesting is here's the Three Fork well. Notice the Three Fork wells makes a lot more water than oil and a lot more water than gas, which is different than the Middle Bakken well. So when you just would look at that, you would say something's going on here that we might have an indication of something to understand. So what was really interesting is just looking at this, and we didn't get a sample at that period of time because we weren't doing adaptive sampling, but the well in the Three Forks, remember, it's deeper, it was shut down. And when it shut down, you see that there was an increase in water production. And when you produced more water, you produced less oil and gas. So it's like, okay, let's figure out, now that we know where the fracture water came from and where it possibly would have went, let's try to figure out which formation is the produced water coming from. And so we're going to use something called strontium isotope and strontium residual salts analysis. But one of the key things that I'll do at the end is we're doing studies now where we're just looking at inner well comparison, where we don't need to do the residual salts analysis until we figure out which facies to do. So this inner well comparison, I won't necessarily talk about much, but let's talk about the residual salts analysis that is the foundation of some of our conceptual models and working hypothesis. So here is the isotope ratio of 87 to 86 strontium. And really, we're good to the 4th or 5th decimal place. And researchers have studied that the oceans have had different ratios of this isotope through time. And so one of the things is when we're forming the carbonate rocks and some other evaporites, we think we're going to lock in what was this isotopic ratio with time. Now, the big question is, can we change the pore water chemistry in terms of strontium isotope ratios? And the answer is, well, one way to do that is to take a core and take some material out of the middle of the core, crush it up, add some water to it, then send it to the lab and have the concentration of that measured. Now we have to do some assumptions to actually figure out what is that concentration of the formation water. So we take the concentration of the leachate and we have the volume of leachate. This we measure in the lab, that we measure in the lab, this we measure in the lab. And now we can figure out what's the porosity. And then this is where Steve and I have spent a lot of time looking at logs and looking at other things of trying to come up with an SW and an RW for these different units. And so this is still sort of a lot of professional judgment comes into coming up with what is the actual concentration of a unit. But the real nice thing is when you're doing the isotopic ratios, or you're doing ratios of cations to cations or anions, you really can eliminate a lot of these estimates, and the strontium isotope ratio doesn't require this set of assumptions being required. We like to do this process, but in the end, we found that the strontium isotope ratio, so when we mix things, we're going to always weight the isotopic ratio higher than the other things that we get from this residual salts. So the core can be sitting around for years or decades. We want all the liquids to evaporate. And all we're basically doing is remobilizing those salt crystals in there. Now, some of them might not come out in the distilled water, and some might, because it's so diluted, because of solubility, we might get that we can't just multiply these things out because there might be a solubility limit. So there's a little bit of art in this. But let's just look at what happens when we do the strontium ratio isotopes. So this is a study that was done in the Williston Basin. Again, this is from ConocoPhillips. Here's the ERTEC paper. They didn't have a unit, but basically, if we just look at this strontium isotope ratio, the carbonates are going to be a lot less radiogenic. And then the clays are going to be much more radiogenic. So when we look at the residual salts analysis for the upper middle Bakken shale, you can see it's much more radiogenic compared to the middle Bakken. And then when we go into the Three Forks, which is mainly a carbonate unit, you see that they're all much less radiogenic in that space. So this is our geology, and this is our residual salts analysis. Now we put in, what does the produced water look like? So in the paper, they report that they had produced water from the middle Bakken lateral and from the Three Fork lateral. And again, they're just taking water off the bottom of the separator and analyzing it there. This is where we do the residual salts analysis to get each one of these numbers. And we kind of interpreted their data differently than they did, where we just said, well, if we just pick a range of strontium 87, 86 isotope ratios, it's kind of amazing that the produced water in the middle Bakken looks almost identical to the produced water in the Three Forks, which looks almost identical to one of the facies that was sampled in the Three Forks. So that was one study. And now a different study that's in this ERTEC paper that Sean and his co-workers published on was they took the samples from the lodgepole and then the scallion unit. And again, these are more pure carbonates, and you see a lot less radiogenic. Then when we go into the shale, we get a very more radiogenic strontium isotope. In the middle Bakken, it's pretty homogeneous, where it's about the same ratio for the residual salts analysis. So remember, this is the residual salts analysis that allows us to assign a range of numbers. And here's the Three Forks. So we have a range here of what the Three Forks strontium isotope could be. Now, just looking at these general shapes of these curves, you can see that it's not one homogeneous unit. So let's look at this Three Forks in a little bit of a zoomed in view. So in that zoomed in view, we can see that the residual salts analysis, this curve right here is the porosity derived from logs. And we saw that there was an association on a subset of this. We didn't have the full set of data when we came up with this association of a log-derived property with the strontium residual salt analysis isotope. And we also saw that visually we could see that there was something different between these things. So when we look at this range of isotope ratios, and again, we were looking at water saturations, we were looking at the concentrations, but for today's talk, I'm just going to focus on the isotope ratios. We then had that time series. Remember, we showed you all those samples that were collected. We collected samples over a much longer time. So remember, we said that the middle Bakken was pretty homogeneous, which goes from this top green layer. So the residual salts numbers for all of the middle Bakken samples fell within this region of the isotope ratio between this to this. The produced, and then all the Three Forks, the highest strontium isotope ratio is right here, the lowest was right here. And through time, the produced waters did go up and down, and it is kind of interesting that they sort of track together. And the thickness of these symbols is basically the error associated with any isotope ratio measurement. So within analytical error, these things track fairly well, and we got some pretty positive feedback in terms of other things that we had monitored on the site, that they were basically both producing out of the same water storage unit, and that flow back was coming back from that. And so we inferred that basically whatever frac water we put into the middle Bakken probably ended up into the Three Forks. And so again, we were kind of encouraged by this relationship and thought that we'd be able to figure out which facies were coming from what by seeing where these isotope ratios were actually landing. So currently right now, what we're doing is looking at water chemistry from the wells, and companies have a lot of water chemistry of the produced water because they collect that water for both scale and corrosion and for a bunch of other reasons other than identifying the source of the water. But by analyzing and looking at those sort of things, and then looking at things that have been landed above the Austin Chalk, in the Austin Chalk, things that are landed in the upper Eagle Ford, lower Eagle Ford, the Buddha, and in the Edwards, this is just a way that we can then look at water chemistry and say, where does it look like that water's coming from? Which signature is coming from? By adding the extra dimension of the residual salts, some of these probables or impossibles go to definitely impossible to almost probable. But the interesting thing is these things go on through time. So we want to look at what the production data looks like. And again, that depositional environment sets up what sort of minerals were there and what sort of diagenesis. One of the key things that Steve and I have been working on, and it's sort of our holy grail, is what is the RW variation of the resistivity of these different facies. We believe that this data has allowed us to say there is quite a big difference in terms of resistivity, or TDS, in these formation waters because of the diagenesis, and that we also think that the saturations have an insight into which are going to be the brinier waters and which ones are going to be the fresher waters. We keep on seeing, every time we see a shale, we see a much fresher water than the surrounding carbonates or silicates. And so anyways, this is just one of the tools that I have kind of labeled the petroleum aqueous geoengineering. We're doing the traditional porosity, we're doing the traditional water saturations, but we're now breaking units up into much finer and finer units. And now we can break those up into finer and finer units. And once we start to do that, we can then type the waters with the residual salts analysis, that it's not necessary that we be precise in terms of where these are, but that we kind of know that in this formation right here, we have a lot more light blue here than the dark purple here. And basically, when we do these analysis, we can say, oh, produced water that has this signature means that this is where the water actually is coming from. And it could be because we charged it up when we fracked it, or when we water flooded it, and now we're purging that water out of there, or that the oil in the water, this is where the active flow unit is. So with that said, one of the things that I wanted to show you is when you take multiple readings, what you can do is not just do the strontium isotopes, you can do ratios, you can do TDS, you can do several other things. The stable isotope will tell you how much surface water there is, which is represented in gray. And then we identified a saltier water, silicate deposition is this yellow. And then this fresher water silicate was a brown. So this is just one way that we can then start to say, oh, of these 13 produced water samples, these two were all fresh water. This one was mainly silicates. And then these ones up here were a combination of silicates and carbonate waters. And when we look at the geological column, we can see where that sat relative to the landing zone. So with that, I'd like to say an appreciation that besides the stuff that we've shown in the literature and done for clients, several organizations helped with me doing some lab experiments and some other things. And so it was sort of sweat equity and a lot of donations by all these people here that I just wanted to acknowledge. So thank you very much. And by the way, the background that I have is a tailings pond that actually is man-made, but you can see all the preferential fluid paths. So thank you. I guess we're ready for questions if there are any.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Pantano. We are ready to receive any question if there are any. All right. If there aren't any questions, we would like to thank you, Dr. Pantano, for your contribution. A very informative session. And it was our pleasure to have you with us. And we thank you for sharing with us your valuable time and experience. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank you all for joining us this evening. Stay safe and have a great night. Thank you, Dr. Pantano.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
We did as well.